I think we are here. Happy Earth Day. How's everybody feeling today? We're here for this event about COVID-19 and what it's teaching us about climate change. And my name is Lisa Ann Pinkerton. I'm the chairwoman of Women in Cleantech and Sustainability. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed that little video as a way to celebrate our lovely planet and what we're doing to save it. We have a little housekeeping to do here, so I'm going to share another screen real quick. If I can find it. See, this is why I shouldn't be driving. Okay.
Lisa, and someone in the chat wants to know what was that video.
Yeah, I should actually, well, Sarah Fuentes, who is our vice chairwoman, introduced me to that video today. I had never seen it. So Sarah, do you want to tell us what that video was?
Sure. With Little Dicky, the Earth. I can add the link in the comments or in the chat. But I'm going to be off because my house is really loud.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's add it in the chat. All righty. So our event today is what COVID-19 is teaching us about climate change. And we're super excited for you all to join us. First, some housekeeping. So we're going to do some introductions, talk about a little bit of Zoom etiquette. Then we'll have some opening remarks by the team. We'll have our panelists, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Also, and then we'll wrap it up. And then also, because usually at in-person events, you get a chance to actually talk to the speakers if you want to. The speakers have been incredibly generous at offering up their time, so they're going to stick around afterwards. And if you want to be put in a breakout room with one of the speakers, just let Melanie Lucas Conwell know. So ping her privately, let her know what breakout room you want to be in. Does that sound good, Melanie? All right, cool. So if some of you aren't aware about Women in Cleantech and Sustainability, this is our shameless plug. We are a network of women and men, mostly in the Bay Area, but these virtual events are expanding us out throughout the world, which we're super excited about. We aim to have monthly events, in person or virtual. We have an annual mentorship program that you might be interested in. And then we've become pretty well known for our TED style conference that Google hosts with us every year, as well as a startup pitch competition that we do at the WCS Talks event for female-focused founders.
To add the beautiful visuals that I know you have prepared, we're currently seeing your other screen, if you don't mind bringing the slides back to the main screen.
Oh, I see what I did there. Okay. I have two screens.
Sorry
about that, everybody. So you're going to see me looking at the other screen for a second. Okay. The more I do this, I'll get better at it. I'd like to welcome our speakers. So we have Christian Rosland, who's the editorial director of the Rocky Mountain Institute, Allison Paradise, founder and CEO of My Green Lab, and Sanchali Pal, founder and CEO of Joro, and they're going to be our guest speakers for today. And with that, I think, Melanie, you want to give any more housekeeping items before we get started on the panel?
Sure. For those that might not have used Zoom before, welcome to this wonderful virtual universe. You're all muted by default, so if you we'll have a section for Q&A towards the end of the event. Save your questions for then. We'll also be monitoring the chat as we go along and giving you a heads up that the Q&A will be coming up. So save those salient questions towards the end for our great speakers today. As Lisa Ann mentioned, we'll have a optional breakout room towards the end of the event. So if you want to message me with a request for which speaker you want to be speaking with, to mimic the go up to the top of the room and ask questions of the speakers, shake hands and whatnot, we will be doing that at the 6 o'clock mark. looking forward to a great event, and feel free to message me, chat me privately if you have any questions, thoughts, feedback. I'll be the tech person behind all of this.
Thank you, Melanie. And also, if people want to network virtually at this event, we can encourage you to just post a little blurb about yourself in the chat with your LinkedIn profile. That's what we've been doing for our virtual happy hours, and it seems to work out pretty well. For those of you who are dialing in, if you would like to join on video, we welcome you to do that, so it can be a little bit more interactive for everybody on the video. It's cool if you're not, though. And I think we should get started. So it's Earth Day, it's the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and it is a momentous time, specifically because we're in the midst of this global pandemic, and what it's really doing is showing us what's possible in terms of cleaner air and maybe some alternatives to how we operate ourselves in the world, virtual events versus in-person events, and a bunch of people flying everywhere. Obviously, there's a lot of like really big challenges related to this pandemic, but when it comes to climate change here at WCS, we thought that there were some pretty interesting correlations and some learnings that we could take out of what's going on today and relate that to climate action. So that's the topic of today's event. And the first person I want to introduce and speak with is Christian Rosland. So he's, like I mentioned, the editorial director at the Rocky Mountain Institute. And prior to joining RMI, he was the US editor of PV Magazine for nearly a decade. He covered a variety of stories, solar, energy, storage, basically a lot of stuff around the energy transition. He's extremely knowledgeable in this aspect. He's also written for IEEE Spectrum and The Guardian and many other publications. So Christian, I want to welcome you to our event today.
Thank you so much, Lisanne. It's a real pleasure to be here. I feel honored to get to talk with women at Cleantech, in Cleantech and sustainability. I've been a fan of this group for a while and of the various organizing. From the time I worked in the solar industry, you know, I noticed that there were still some definite gender issues, some definite sexism that we saw. And, you know, it's really great to, I think the organizing that you're doing is really important and that you're hoping.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So Christian, one of the reasons that you and I started talking about you coming on to this event was because you co-authored this article with Ned Harvey and Tyler Matsuo at the Rocky Mountain Institute called COVID-19 and Climate Risk Mitigation and Resilience. And I was really impressed by that article, mostly because you mentioned some concepts around the 21st century being, quote, you know, we have to both mitigate risks for future disasters while also at the same time responding to the urgent demands of the current crisis. And so my first question for you is, in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, why do you think there's still a place for climate action?
Thanks for that question, Lisanne. So, you know, just step back a second to explain a bit where this piece came from. You know, we at Rocky Mountain Institute are really increasingly gearing our work towards, you know, what do we need to do to be on a pathway to keep global average temperature rise below 1.5 C. And RMI, with its 38 years of techno-economic expertise, you know, and research, you know, had a lot of information, around a lot of different areas. And suddenly COVID-19 hits and nobody wants to talk about climate change because everyone wants to talk about the disaster that's happening right now. And this was an opportunity to talk about the work that some of the other work that we do, because we've always worked in resilience as well. We've always, you know, if you look at the mission statement, it's not just a low carbon future, it's a clean, secure, prosperous low carbon future. And so what that means is, that means solutions that, you know, that keep the lights on after a hurricane. That means dealing with the very real disasters that have been happening already in the 21st century, in part as a result of climate change. You know, that's some of our work in the Caribbean that deals with how, you know, our team there has created guides as to how you make PV systems, solar systems that are resilient and can survive a Category 5 hurricane. We've also worked on resilience in the Roaring Fork Valley in Colorado. And, you know, these are all solutions that involve renewable energy. These are all solutions that involve climate mitigation, but they also involve keeping the lights on when there's a disaster. And that's really important. It's really important that our energy systems not only be low carbon energy systems, but be energy systems that can survive the tests that we're going to put them through, because the truth is that the 21st century is a risky place. This current crisis that we're dealing with, I haven't personally seen a direct link to climate change, but a lot of the other crises that we've been seeing and a lot of the other disasters are directly linked to climate change, whether we're talking about the wildfires in Australia or the wildfires in California, or the increasing rate and severity of hurricanes in the Caribbean or the Gulf Coast. These things, they're hitting more often, they're hitting more severely, and we have to come up with solutions that work in the face of these problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think and it's sad to think about how, humans pretty much only deal with what's in front of them. I mean, that's kind of how the human brain is wired. You deal with your most immediate needs first, right? And current self gets the treatment that future self might not get, because current self has to stay alive. And so that's what we're obviously seeing in this pandemic. And at the same time, I think people get a chance to understand that the way we're globally reacting to what is happening with this pandemic, and the swift action that globally we were able to make to address a very real threat, gives us a window into how we could be acting related to climate change. We were willing to sacrifice the economy to take care of this situation. Now, I'm not saying that to address climate change, you need to do that, but there's a lot of people that use the economy as an excuse for why we're not going to address climate change.
Absolutely, 100%. So, the truth is that the solutions that we're talking about deploying to address climate change they're not only not going to wreck the economy, but at this point, wind and solar are cheaper sources of electricity than fossil fuels. In most of the United States, they're cheaper than gas, they're cheaper than coal pretty much in the entire United States. And globally, when you look at it, wind and solar are the cheapest forms of electricity generation in an increasing number of places. So we can actually be doing this with greater prosperity, but we need to do it. But we need to do it, and we need to accelerate it. And you're right, we can make change quickly, and COVID-19 has shown that when there is societal buy-in, when we as a society decide that we're going to move quickly and make changes quickly, we can. We haven't made this decision yet around climate change, and we haven't because climate change is this far off thing. It's this, but in the 21st century, it's not always far off. When I look at New York, I look at what New York did before Hurricane Sandy and after Hurricane Sandy. New York at this point in time has a commitment to completely decarbonize its electricity system. And it has one of the more aggressive commitments in terms of the electricity sector. Now, this did not happen in a vacuum. This happened after Hurricane Sandy really hit and wrecked New York. And I think Governor Cuomo, and I think a lot of the leaders in the legislature saw that, and they said, we need to do something because we're going to get hammered over and over again. But the thing is, it's not just New York. Miami's in deep trouble.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of cities in the New Orleans is in deep trouble. A lot of cities in the United States are in deep trouble because with these more severe hurricanes and as the sea level rises, these cities are going to be underwater. So we have a choice. We can accelerate this process now and reap the benefits, or we can have to pay big time later. And so you're absolutely right in understanding that we're good at dealing with the problems right in front of our face, but we have a lot harder time dealing with the long-term solutions. And that's why, we're proposing this solution that is a combination of resilience and mitigation, because you can do both at the same time. You can address the needs of the now while addressing the long-term needs. Mm-hmm. There's tremendous opportunities right now with the various stimulus measures that are being crafted, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, to put people back to work, doing the work that will make a more resilient economy and society, that will make a fairer one, that will make a cleaner one, and one that is more low carbon. And there are so many examples. We could be putting people back to work weatherizing homes. We could be putting people back to work electrifying homes and businesses and getting the gas appliances out that are not good for our health indoors. you know, we could be putting people back to work creating an electric vehicle charging network throughout the United States. And these are win-win situations. These are situations that it's not where we're having to say, oh, do we decarbonize or do we support economic growth? No, we can do both at the same time, and we can do both more effectively by meeting these multiple goals.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, the UN, I forget which officer put out a statement yesterday saying, you think the pandemic is bad, just wait until climate change hits full bore, and we haven't done anything to mitigate it. And so I really like this idea. It sort of helps to solve this problem of the current self and the future self by saying, look what's happening here, and you can expect something like this or worse is going to happen if we don't address climate change. So you're feeling the pain now, and you can expect the pain to come later if you don't make it a change.
Absolutely. And it's not just, oh, this might happen later. No, this is where we're going. We're going to a future of more crises. We're going to a future of more disasters. You know, it's a very clear progression. Look at Australia, look at California, look at what's happened to the Caribbean in recent years. This is not going to be pretty, but we have an opportunity to affect the severity of it. You know, we have an opportunity right now and over the next 10 years to decide whether or not we are going to have a livable planet for future generations. And, you know, it couldn't be more serious.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Christian. Really appreciate you being here. I completely agree with you. I would like you to hold on. We have another guest, Allison Paradise, that we want to introduce, and then I'm sure we'll have more questions for you when we bring the Q&A portion of the event into play. So thank you, Christian. The next speaker I'd like to introduce is Allison Paradise. She is the CEO and founder of My Green Lab, which is a pioneer in laboratory sustainability. And the organization developed the first nationally recognized standard for laboratory operations, and also established a first Energy Star category for laboratory equipment. Recently, they also released a first eco-label for laboratory products. And so we invited Allison to come onto the event today because we thought that there might be some information and some learnings that she could provide from her laboratory experience that might be applicable for the larger COVID-19 world. So Allison, welcome to the webinar.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So in terms of biopharma and R&D operations, since COVID-19 has hit, what have you seen that's changed?
It's a very good question. So I can say from our experience here in California that it seems like most of the biopharmers are open, but they have limited staffing at the moment. That's because I think most of them are doing the best they can to try to research the current situation, to come up with vaccines, to better understand the virus. I looked into statistics globally, and it looks like 22% of labs are closed globally in biopharma. About 57% have reduced operations, and the rest of them are still open. So it's an interesting sector because they haven't entirely shut down. They still have to be doing some of their work. And so it's been interesting trying to navigate that and our message of sustainability while people are so focused on the crisis. So very similar to what Christian was saying in sort of a general population, but a very specific population that we're working with.
And I like this population and the labs and talking about the labs because it's sort of this cross section of needing to maintain certain scientific standards and you know, sterile equipment and these types of things, which often require single use plastics and other items, while at the same time having a mission to prioritize sustainability. So it's sort of like this delicate balancing act that I can imagine only gets larger when you take it to like hospital situations and these types of things. So what type, like, are you still seeing sustainability prioritized in the labs at this time? And how are people balancing these two desires?
Yeah, like really another great question. So I would say, our nonprofit takes a very different approach to sustainability, which I think helps people with that balance, and maybe also speaks a bit to the conversation you just had with Christian, in that we tend to focus on individual behavior and make it very much about the present moment. So we don't really spend a lot of time talking about the potential of what could happen in the future. Because we found that with our audience, it doesn't motivate them to do anything differently because they are so focused on the work that they're doing, and they're working on cures for diseases. So the thought that they would put that down for something else doesn't really resonate with them. So instead we say, look, this is about you. So sustainability, it's personal, right? It starts with every single one of us. So what choices can you make today for yourself that will best sustain you and your work? And we ask them to question kind of what they are used to doing. So we make this sort of the statement that as scientists, we're taught to do something in a certain way, right? We're taught to follow protocols. It's the same in healthcare. It's quite frankly the same in our lives, right? We have these certain routines that we follow. So we ask scientists to question themselves. Why do I do it this way? And if it's just because it's the way I've always done it, why not try doing something differently? And with that approach, it still fits into the current situation because it's not asking you to think beyond where you are right now. So we have seen people still embrace the message of sustainability, whether they're working in the lab or whether they're at home. What'll be interesting is what happens when everybody goes back, that's a different story, or maybe.
Well, what do you think might happen when people go back, when things go back to the normal way of doing things?
If they ever do.
Yeah.
It looks like a lot of the biofarmers are going to be rotating people for a very long time. So on shifts, which will be very different than it's been in the past. So I imagine we'll start to see shifts in how, in particular, equipment is used, where in the past we used to be able to say, why not turn it off at night? I'm not so sure we'll be able to go back to that anytime soon. What I do think is that there'll probably be a bump where people are not focused on it at all, because in our case, they're researchers, they have projects to try to finish up. But we've been working with leadership to get them to continue to have that message so that they don't lose it, the thread between now and when people come back immediately. And then, 2 months later, where now they've settled in and maybe more receptive to the message. So our strategy is really work with leadership, get the messaging all set, get everything ready to go. And then when people are open to it, we can have it ready.
And then do you mind giving us just one or two examples of how you help labs think differently and think more sustainably? Do you have a specific example of a shift that they might do?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'll come up with two. So one that's really straightforward, as I think most of you know, labs use quite a few chemicals, right? And reagents. A lot of those are really hazardous and toxic to people and to the planet. So in thinking about this framework of why do I do something this way, we often say to people, look, this protocol calls for this chemical that is, say, neurotoxin. Why are you still using this? It's not necessarily required, so why not try a more sustainable substitution that isn't going to harm you, isn't going to harm the planet, and also in its production isn't hazardous and toxic the whole way through the supply chain. So that's an example. Another example to tie into energy, for example, energy efficiency, is a lot of work is done with cold storage, and in fact, this really applies in particular to the COVID-19 situation, where the protocols for the testing require that the samples be stored at specific set point temperatures. One of the amazing things that's happened that's come out of this is that the CDC guidelines for storage have taken into account a temperature difference that we've recommended for years, whereas samples, instead of being stored at -80, are stored at -70. That allows for a 30 to 40% energy reduction in the consumption of those freezers, which typically use as much as a house. So if you imagine, the CDC probably has 2,000 freezers. They save 30 to 40% of that energy by setting them to -70. So that's a guideline that we've been pushing for a while, and now as a result of this, we can say, hey, look, the CDC recommends this now, which is really good. So yeah, those are the types of things that we recommend, the types of things that we ask people to question. They're all very personal, they're all very individual, but on a collective basis, look, the biopharma industry, it produces more greenhouse gas emissions than the automotive industry. Think about that. It's huge. So the more people can do to change their behavior, the more impact this is going to have across on all of us, really.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Allison. That's a great message to end your time on. So
Sure.
thank you. Stay
Thank you.
with us because I'm sure people will have questions for you. And so our next guest is Sanchali Pal, and she is the founder of and CEO of Joro. And the startup's mission is to make climate action accessible to everyone by leveraging app technology that makes carbon tracking easier. So welcome, Sanchali.
Thanks.
So my first question for you is, so globally, we've seen a drop in airline travel and shuttered factories and people working from home when they can. Energy use across the country has dropped like roughly 30%. So this list, goes on and on. So while this has significantly reduced our carbon footprint, I'd say, globally, obviously things are going to change when everybody's allowed back outside again. So, how do you think things are going to change once the countries reopen?
It's a great question. I mean, I think it's going to happen gradually. We don't know a lot about what the path to some sort of normal looks like yet, but I think we do know that a few things will be true. I think we know that air travel will be slow to recover, and that will take longer. So probably the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from air travel will continue. Currently, we're at 2 to 3% of air travel volume versus normal, which is enormously different. I think after 9/11, it was something like 20 to 30% decline in air travel. So it's a totally different order of magnitude. And I think both within the country and certainly international travel will be lower. Remote work will probably still be a part of our routine, even if some of us do return to the office. There probably will be more use of remote work. There'll be much fewer large meetings. There will probably be less travel for work. So all of those things will continue to keep emissions down. One of the other big reasons why emissions have been down is because a lot of factories and commercial buildings have been closed. Hopefully we'll see some of that production ramp up for people's jobs and livelihoods and for the economy. But I think we'll probably also, just like in China, the increase in emissions resulting from factories reopening hasn't overcompensated yet for the reduction we saw before. So probably that will continue to keep emissions down. And I'm curious if maybe some of the more like soft elements of quarantine will stick with us, like spending more time outside. Spending time outside is a zero carbon activity. It's a great substitute for doing more carbon intensive things like, I don't know, going to a movie theater. But there might be some things like that stick as part of our routines, or spending more time at home, cooking more plant-based meals with things that can stick around in our pantries for longer, being more careful about food waste. Those are the sorts of things that I hope are behaviors that will be improvements and will stay after quarantine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with you. I saw a study, 48% of people who were working from home for the first time wanted it to continue. And then, conversely, 38% couldn't wait to get back to the office. So, but I think we're seeing this grand experiment that's going to show managers and C-suite executives, yes, people can be productive when they work from home. And by the way, if you shift up your work culture to allow people to work from home, you don't need as big of an office. You don't need to spend that money and that energy costs on your office. And then you would have a smaller footprint because of that, I would think.
Yeah, it could help solve. I mean, I've seen some really interesting analysis talking about how we might be able to repurpose commercial buildings for housing, affordable housing, especially in overcrowded cities. So I'm really curious if there might be some positive follow-on benefits for lots of different causes.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So your app helps people to track their carbon footprint. So can you just give us a little bit of an explanation of what you guys do?
Yeah, so there's lots of tools out there for getting a sense of what your carbon footprint is, but almost all of them are static point-in-time estimates that rely largely on manual input. What we try to do is provide users an automated real-time picture of their carbon footprint, much in sort of a similar way to how you might track your footsteps or your calories. We're trying to provide an easy way to do that with carbon and include carbon in your decision making alongside time, cost, convenience, and other factors. So users connect their credit card or debit card to the app to get a real-time picture of how their consumption has an impact on the planet, and then get actions that they can take through behavior change or offsets.
That's fantastic. Okay, that's cool. I'm gonna have to check it out. So then when we think about these collective mobilization, how do you think this global community is going to, rally around climate change in the face of this virus?
Yeah, it's not easy. I keep thinking about how there's not really a lot of space in people's brains for two crises at once. We are, as humans, are procrastinators and are dealing with whatever crisis seems to be most present right now. Also, it's a really big crisis, so it makes complete sense that people are focusing on COVID right now. It's people's lives that are in danger and their livelihoods. But I think that there's a lot of positive overlap that between the two as well, in terms of at least staying home is good for the planet. It could be that whatever was required to solve coronavirus was bad for the planet. What if it meant that we all needed to go drive our cars all day? That would be terrible. So thank goodness, we can flatten both curves at the same time. That's one good thing. And for me, a big takeaway is the power of collective action. I mean, it's the same logic that people apply, saying why should I stay at home? I'm alone, not going to stop millions of people from dying. But when we all do it together, we can see the curve flatten. I think this language of flattening the curve is actually really helpful. We should have probably been using this language for climate change a long time ago. It's the exact same thing that we're trying to do. One person eating a burger isn't going to cause the planet to light on fire. But if we all together change towards more plant-based diets, we can flatten the curve. We can buy ourselves time. It's the same argument. The purpose of collective action is to buy ourselves time so that we can come up with those longer term technological solutions. And one way that I've heard people talk about the challenge of solving or reducing greenhouse gas emissions as individuals is trying to buy ourselves 15 to 20 years to find those breakthrough technologies that will allow us to build a society that is more sustainable in the long run. But if we continue as we are now, we just don't have enough time to find those solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you said. We're flattening both curves, and we probably should have been using this messaging all along, but maybe we needed an experience like COVID-19 to point us in that direction. I'd like to open this up to everybody if you have questions, and please raise your hands. And or Melanie, how do you want to do the questions? We didn't cover that part.
Yes, so we've had one question in the chat so far from our dear Sarah Porchason, which was a question for Christian. Is the oil price drop a threat to renewable energy?
So I actually ended up answering that in the chat, but I realized that it went privately. I'm happy to answer it publicly for everyone. So in terms of renewable energy, no. Now, it's not to say that there's no impact, but the truth is that petroleum-fired generation is a very small part of the overall electricity fleet in the continental United States, more in Hawaii. So if suddenly oil becomes cheap, that doesn't mean that we're going to start burning a lot more of it to make electricity, because we just simply don't have that many oil-fired power plants left anymore. That was more a matter in the 1970s. In the 1970s, we got a lot more of our power from petroleum, but it hasn't made economic sense for decades. Now, there is a little bit of a concern in terms of electric vehicles. For fleet owners, a sustained low oil price, and I think that we are looking right now at a sustained low oil price. There's a huge overabundance of oil, negative oil future prices. It's insane. So there's likely to be an excess of oil for a while. And that could affect the decisions that fleet owners make in terms of whether or not to move their fleets over to electricity. But for individual consumers, it's unlikely to do much. And the reason is that most people, when they're deciding whether to buy a gas-powered car or an electric car, they don't make that based on the price of gas. They make that based on the sticker price of the EV. So the battery price matters a lot more than the gas price. So overall, no, I think a lot of, there's been a lot of that connection drawn in the media. I remember when we had some low oil prices a few years ago, people said, oh no, it's the end for renewable energy. And it wasn't at all, because, while there is some transfer between sectors of, say, electrifying transportation connects those two sectors, right now we use liquid fuels largely for transportation, and we use other fuels like coal and natural gas for electricity. So they just don't.
Yeah.
Transfer
And
over
also, I mean, there's when we think about fleets too, one of my clients would talk about how in a time of low oil prices, that actually means that you have extra budget to convert your fleets to electric. And then in times of high oil prices, everybody complains that they don't have the money to convert to electric, right? So,
Yeah, that. Yeah, Lisa Ann knows quite a bit about this stuff too, by the way. I'm not the only expert here. Yeah, the other thing to consider is that the price of fuel is not the only input here. One of the big advantages of electric vehicles is they're vastly more efficient in terms of the energy that goes in versus the energy that makes it to the wheel. They're also simpler, and so they require less maintenance and they last longer. There's just a lot fewer parts. It's actually really hard to take a liquid fuel and explode that and then make something move versus running it off a battery. So you just, the lower maintenance cost, the lower lifetime ownership means that there's still, in a lot of cases, a good case to be made for electric vehicles, even if gas is cheap. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Christian. We have more questions that are coming in, and I'd like to encourage the people who have these questions to go ahead and answer them, ask them themselves, because we want to see you here on the video as well, and give you a chance to participate. So Melanie, who do you think should go next?
We have a question from Leah, if you want to ask it live with your beautiful backdrop.
Yeah, hi. So my question is really to all three of you. And, we've seen all these amazing environmental benefits that are coming, like the silver lining of what's happening is the environmental benefits we've been seeing. But when we transition to the post-COVID normal world, not that 6 months or maybe the next couple of years, but in the long term, what do we think could be the largest environmental benefits as a result of like the societal behavior changes we're adopting right now?
Any of you speakers are welcome to go first if you like.
Allison or Sanchit?
Sure.
Sure.
I mean, I think,
Oh, go ahead.
okay. I was going to say, I think travel is probably the most obvious one, and probably the one that's the most long lasting, because so many people are recognizing, right, that they don't have to travel as much as they have been. And it's the one that's, I think, the easiest to continue to propagate. My first thought was, and my first hope was reduce consumption, because I think we're learning about what is actually essential and what that means. But I recognize that in order for the economy to come back to any semblance of what it was before, we're going to have to undo that, because we can't be both saying nothing's essential and revitalizing all the businesses that have lost business. So unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be that one. I think it's probably going to be travel.
Sanchali, do you have anything to share?
Yeah, no, I agree that that's definitely a big one. I'm curious if this will also drive innovation to different places. So because we're spending so much time at home, I don't know about you guys, but I've noticed my home energy bill go up in the last month. And I imagine that maybe home energy efficiency or cleaning, electrifying the house might be an interesting area that we'll see more innovation, and that will also drive emissions reduction on the grid or in the home. And then more broadly, like reduced emissions is one type of environmental benefit that we'll see, but potentially we'll also see benefits in terms of reduced pollution or improved environments for biodiversity. Those are the types of changes that will be dependent on continued change in behavior, though. So certainly if people return back to normal levels of driving, we'll see particulate matter increase in cities like New Delhi or Beijing, where it's declined significantly. But that could be another type of environmental benefit besides just emissions reduction.
I also wonder around consumption related to food, in terms of, people are cooking more at home. People maybe who didn't think that they were that great at cooking have discovered that actually they are pretty good at cooking and they like cooking at home, and so there might be less going out to eat or less ordering out, and then a reduction in the waste that comes from those from restaurants related to that. Although that then has a sort of a domino effect, because food banks get a lot of their produce and their food from restaurants that aren't using it. So there are some other ecosystems that would be affected around something like
Actually,
that.
related to that, there's also some interesting momentum behind plant-based meats now, because some of these pandemics originated from humans eating animals. So I think there's an interesting confluence between like the medical community and the environmental community on trying to find new alternatives to meat that do not come from animals and don't pose the same health risks.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Melanie, who should be our next question? Oh, Christian, go ahead. Sorry.
So if I can get in here real quick, I think those are really good answers and things that I hadn't thought of. I just wanted to add that you alluded to this earlier, Lisa, and I think one of the biggest changes is that we're realizing that we can make change quickly. A lot of the things that we took for granted of, oh, it just has to be this way. No, we're realizing that, if it's a crisis and if we take it seriously as a crisis, we can shift our behaviors fairly rapidly. And I think that alone is profound.
Absolutely. In my mind, there's absolutely no excuse anymore. We have proven to ourselves in this the current generations that are living now, no one has an excuse for saying that we can't act globally to make a significant change in a very fast time frame, because we've done it. So that excuse for me is off the table. But I'll get off my soapbox because we have other people who want to ask questions.
We have an anonymous question that's for, go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Mel. Kind of based on what Lisa and you just said, building off that momentum, like we are so reactionary to things, and how do we take some of these things that are going to come from the good, or not the good, but be a result because of COVID? How do we like pull those threads forward and not just kind of like return to our normal world? Now people have gotten used to like seeing the skies in LA and India and other places around the world. So how do we kind of like continue to pull that thread and not kind of just, return to our normal lives? And there's a really good article, I'm not sure if people have read, it's called Prepare for the Ultimate Gaslighting, and I'll put the link in the chat. And it's just kind of saying how this return to normal and how companies are going to try to profit off of COVID and downplay it and say, you didn't see people dying, you didn't see, stores running out of food, and kind of return to this normal. But, I don't want to return to that normal. I want to return to a normal of blue skies. And how can we take this and pull it forward?
Yeah, Sanchali, do you have any thoughts there, since you're pretty close around collective action and mobilizing people for change?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't hear that whole question. Could you repeat it again?
Well, how do we keep people from just going back to the old way of doing things? Because there's probably economic and political interests that would seek to encourage that, right? And so how do we help people change their perspectives so that they can so that we can move forward in a new way and not go back to our old ways of consumption?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a good question, and I think a really difficult one to answer. I think the cynical way of seeing it is that we have to show people it's in their best interests. One thing that's been really powerful about coronavirus is the media's ability to hit home that everyone is at risk and that your loved ones are at risk. and making it really personal for people that, you know, your parents or your friend or you are the ones who are in danger. And I don't think climate is so difficult to do that for. Even though it could be just as true, you never know when a storm's going to hit that's going to affect someone you know or you. But figuring out how to make it personal, I think, is a really big challenge for our movement, and just as much a messaging challenge as it is like a fundamental thing that we have to figure out.
Absolutely. I mean,
But
we know
I'd be
that.
really
Oh,
curious,
okay.
yeah, to hear more.
Sorry, I didn't
other
mean to
people.
interrupt you.
No, I would love to hear other people's thoughts on this question because I think it's a really hairy one.
Well, we definitely know that a lot of conservatives have, who were climate deniers, have converted to being climate believers, simply because something happened to them in their personal life, or they recognize that they were about to leave this world to their grandchildren, and they love their children and grandchildren more than the political affiliation or the party line that they were, you know, elected, I guess, to portray. So again, everybody's got a personal reason why they are active on climate, and a lot of us stumbled into it of our own accord. But other people who aren't thinking that way need a little bit of help to, and a lot of this is just individual one-on-one conversations. I mean, there's a gentleman, a famous blues player, who was tour the South, and he would have one-on-one conversations with KKK members, and he would make friends with them, and he's converted like 500 people out of the KKK, just one-on-one, having these conversations with people. And sometimes I feel like that personally for me, I think those one-on-one conversations and helping to connect personal motivation with what's going on climate, if we all did that, if each of us did that one person a week, you'd have 52 people that you would affected in a year. If 10 people did that, 520 people. Eventually we would get to the most influential people that can really make systemic change.
Alicia, may I add something about the
Yeah,
personal
absolutely.
piece? Because that's so close to what we do, right? That's how we talk about it, as sustainability as being personal. And maybe this is something that our community can think about some more, is reframing this conversation to not be about everything that's external to you. It's not, yes, it is about the sea level rise, and yes, it is about the hurricanes, and yes, it is about all these catastrophic things, but it fundamentally starts with how you sustain yourself and your very being. And I think just on that most basic level, most people have lost touch with what that really even means. If you look at just diets, right, the very thing that sustains us, what we eat, so much of what we eat doesn't actually sustain us. It makes us really sick. So I think if we kind of just start there from a truly personal place, it's much easier then for people to recognize how those actions can then propagate out beyond themselves, right? Everything starts with what we do, and then it propagates beyond us. Very much to your point, right? That all you have to do is talk to one other person, which then talks to one other person. So I think it's a challenge to our community to really start thinking about the fact that sustainability is personal, and not personal in a catastrophic sense, but personal in an actual very real sense, to try to engage people more with this conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Allison. And this kind of goes back to what Sanchali was talking about before we started the Q&As, which is people, if you know, one person can make a difference, especially if we're all moving in that same direction, and it's multiplying our action. And thinking that just, you know, it doesn't matter because you're just one person isn't I think a line of thinking that we get a chance or have the luxury to tolerate anymore. Let's do one more question, and then I think we need to wrap up. So Melanie, who else has a question here that we want to highlight?
Frankly, there's been so much conversation in the chat room that I'm not sure where the last question is, if someone wants to unmute and ask live.
Less of a question, I guess, and more of a conversation starter. Hi, Tanya with Community Energy Labs. A bunch of us are talking about how there's more solar on the grid, particularly in California, than there ever has been before. And so many of us feel really good about ourselves if we're saving energy and if we have solar on our homes. But the truth is that we're often dumping solar onto the grid when it's actually being curtailed. And then we plug in our EV or use power at 5 or 6 p.m. when there is no sun and we need to use gas peakers to power the grid. So thinking about not just storage, because storage can max out on capacity pretty quickly given all the solar we're putting on the grid, but also load flexibility and thinking more and more about when we use energy as individual consumers, setting up in the morning your laundry and your dishes to go at noon when it's more likely to be sunny, checking the CAISO forecast and seeing when renewables are actually producing power. But that's one thing that I think we definitely need to start thinking about as consumers, is not just using less energy, but when we use it if we want a 100% renewable future.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and also, like, we could be making hydrogen with that excess solar that we're just curtailing. There's a lot of different uses, I think, that we get a chance to be a little bit smarter about. So thank you. So we are coming to the end of our time together, and I actually wish this was a longer event. I'm gonna be honest.
I get back to that whole thing about Tanya's point there.
Sure.
That was a really good point. I spent a number of years working on these sorts of issues. Yes, certainly when you use power matters. I think that the current mix that we have on the grid is a moving target. We're adding more storage all the time. This is a very complex and technical matter. There are a lot of ways to skin a cat in terms of how to get to that very high renewable energy future. I think that load flexibility is really important part. I think that will also be accomplished over time with we pass the price signals more onto consumers. So I think time of use pricing, and I think eventually this will get to the point where you pay a different amount depending on the minute that you're using electricity. I think that eventually will push things in the direction that we need. But yeah, load flexibility is important, but there are a lot of ways we could do this. And what's happening with the solar right now is it's being curtailed for economic reasons. If you look at the CAISO curtailment reports, it's economic curtailment. It's not technical curtailment. It's being curtailed because the gas plants are running largely. So.
Fascinating. Okay, well, we've got 2 minutes left if we're going to stay on schedule. And so our speakers are going to go into separate breakout rooms. And if you would like to be in the breakout room with them, privately message Melanie Lucas Conwell here in the chat and let her know where you want to be sent. Or if you just want to hang out in the general room with some of us, we're going to be here. We can network and continue this conversation. But I really want to thank each of our speakers for joining us today on this grand experiment of basically the first virtual panel that Women in Clean Tech and Sustainability has ever done. So thank you so much for joining us today and being here on this 50th anniversary of Earth Day and our first international webinar event, virtual event here. So thank you very much, all of you, and look forward to seeing you on the interweb.